like give them outliers so they can fail their hypotheses.
Yes. And it was asking like, what's your marital status? Do you have any kids? Like, yeah,
There's not, I was gonna say, there's not an option for,
I think we have unions.
Alright,
for either married or.
pull up the notes sometime this morning. So I want to move on to chapter 11. So it splits 11 and 12. 11 kind of goes better into chapter 13, which is the age of exploration. So essentially, 11 takes us all the way back to the Americas. Here, this is something that probably when you guys were in grade school or middle school, you probably did a unit on Native Americans. This is essentially that. All right. So we'll talk about like I'm trying to divide it into kind of the first section, North American Native civilizations, and then tomorrow and Thursday I'll talk about Mesoamerica, and then on Friday I'll finish the chapter talking about Indian or kind of like South American civilizations and that. So like I said, when you guys were probably in grade school, all right, you did a unit on Native Americans, and the kind of the theory is the kind of contemporary kind of popular theory is that what we classify as Native Americans have their origins in essentially Asia, right? So around the last great ice age, 18,000 years ago, there is a large migration, is the theory, that occurs when the Bering Strait is essentially a land bridge, right? And so they refer to it, archaeologists, historians, as Bergenia. It's essentially, basically, today, the Bering Strait that separates North America, i.e. Alaska, from Asia, i.e. Russia, right? And so the theory is that these are people that are essentially kind of migrating, they're nomadic in search of large game, right? Although there are a couple of archaeological discoveries that some have questioned it, that maybe there may have been a migration kind of from the east. This is the general popular theory, right? This is the theory that most kind of historians and anthropologists kind of go with, if you will. All right, so the area like up there at the top left, like I said, that's the theory that we have basically, and eventually over thousands of years, these various kind of people kind of like disperse, separate, kind of develop their own kind of cultures and kind of civilizations, if you will. The closest probably to those original kind of migrants that came across there is a collection of native cultures that are primarily found in the Arctic and subarctic region, stretching from Alaska, Canada, all the way to Greenland, and that's what we classify as the Inuit. In the past, they would refer to them by kind of more antiquated, kind of outdated term Eskimos, right? And so these are the cultures that depend more heavily upon, let's say, like kind of hunting and fishing and such, right? Now, the Inuit is a kind of umbrella term for these various kind of tribes that share certain cultural traits like language and stuff like that. In Canada, the majority of the Inuit live in a territory that was established in 1999. It was carved out of the Northwest Territory called Nunavut. Right, so that's probably the largest kind of collection or largest kind of concentrated population of what we would classify as Inuit. So these areas that we're talking about, and again, there's a lot of these like names like are really like this one, Quikiquataltolok Unalagani. All right, I think I mispronounced that. All right, but they have slight variations in dialect and such. The Canadian government 10 years ago or so, maybe a little bit longer, opened up like whale hunting in certain times for a number of these cultures because it was kind of tied in with their cultural kind of identity. A symbol that kind of represents the Inuit is something called an Inishuk, which would be used for areas of kind of good hunting or for areas of safety. In that, in 2008, when Vancouver hosted the Winter Olympics, an Inishuk was the symbol of the Winter Olympics. They kind of colored it a little bit. And so, like in the Winter Olympics at that time, they kind of celebrated the native cultures, what they call the 200 nations there, with kind of the opening and closing ceremony. In Inuit, like kind of legend and mythology, the Aurora Borealis, the Northern Lights, which find an area, they believe that that's the ancestors that basically inhabit that. And you're not supposed to, according to a legend, if you taunt or laugh at the Northern Lights, which I don't know if you would do that, the ancestors could come down and cut the head off, which seems a little drastic, right? But every kind of culture kind of has mythology and story related with that. Now, eventually, as these cultures kind of left, kind of emerged down from the Arctic region, we start to find a number of cultures that become more sedentary. A lot of this is like associated with agriculture. So in chapter 1, we were talking about domestication of animals and kind of the establishment of systematic agriculture. While we have places like in Mesopotamia, wheat, barley, and rice in East Asia, the crop of corn becomes kind of the dominant crop there. And corn is going to be a revolutionary crop that's kind of going to change kind of like the nature of food and stuff like that. But we have a number of these kind of like early kind of like cultures that are going to find kind of like sedentary kind of existences here. One culture in the American Southwest, which don't necessarily think of agriculture, but through the use of irrigation skills and stuff like that, are going to kind of make a kind of a lasting kind of presence there, are the Anasazi. Now, the name, the Anasazi, actually was a term given to them by their traditional adversaries, the Navajo. It means ancient ones or ancient enemies. So that indicates that they were there before the Navajo. Today, what we normally refer to the Anasazi, the descendants of the Anasazi, are what we refer to as Pueblos. This is a name coming from the Anasazi villages, these Pueblos, which are built literally into cliff sides in many cases. So the Anasazi are going to kind of occupy the area we refer to as the Four Corners. That area, the spot where around like Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona, where you stand in one spot, you're in 4 states, basically, right? This is the area up here, right? Now, a number of these sites have some similarities. Like this one is in Mesa Verde in southwest Colorado. This is called the Cliff Palace, and it's basically built into the side of the cliff, right? And so these are where these pueblos are, and so you have living quarters and dwellings and stuff like that. You see the people kind of gathered around the circle here. These people are looking at what they call the kiva. And so like places like this is at Chaco Canyon, which is in Arizona, I believe. There's some similarities there. They would use them for things like storage rooms for particularly places where you have like kind of this is kind of a cool area, particularly during the kind of the warm months. But also too, a lot of these cultures, every culture tends to have kind of a rite of passage where you kind of transition from being a kid to an adult. And so these kivas they would use for particularly that kind of like rite of passage. A number of kind of people with like young adults or whatever like that would go here. They would basically meditate. They'd also have the help of like hallucinogenic cactus, like peyote and stuff like that. And they would emerge as adults. All right. So the kivas were kind of used like in other native cultures, like they would use them as like sweat lodges and stuff like that. Right. You kind of see in that. So the Anasazi would use those kivas for that. The Anasazis also had, they had probably drawn these maps that are still around, like on the cliff sides there, where you can find water, like kind of like natural springs and stuff. Famously, Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, which were these kind of like American outlaws in the West. They made a movie about it in the 70s. They used those maps, those Anasazi kind of maps, to kind of evade being captured in the area there. And so a little bit closer to us, which I kind of gave you guys a worksheet on yesterday, while the Anasazi are inhabiting kind of the American Southwest, we find what they refer to as the woodland people kind of in this area. Now, a lot of times prior to this, native cultures, they would kind of divide them up between what they call paleo and archaic. Now, it's generally based on the types of tools that were used, and those tools tended to be weapons, mainly like the archaic separated from the paleo, the use of what's called atolls, bolasses, which allow for more communal hunting. But it's here on the whole we start to see things like axes and adazes and things of that nature. So it's believed that this was the native culture that basically starts to harness systematic agriculture. And with that, they start to stay in one place a longer period of time. Believe that particularly in this area and in the Ohio Valley, they were the first of the native cultures to establish settlements, right? And with that comes in the tie in with agriculture. Also, too, the Hopewell, where they built mounds, not as large as what we'll talk about the Mississippians, but in some of those mounds, they would have basically, archaeologists would find remains of people, right? Now, with those remains, they would also find things like buried with them, like jewelry or weapons or tools. So what do we have an indication that they may have believed in if they're burying items with these people? An afterlife, right? Now, we don't know totally sure what their belief system was. We don't know the structure of the society. Because technically, like the Anasazi, the Hopewell are what we would classify as prehistoric. Meaning, what kind of separates prehistory from history? Written records. So a lot of these cultures were not kind of like, they didn't depend upon kind of writing there. So various kind of regions, like this area, like I think it was about 6-7 years ago, they discovered a Hopewell site between the Plow and Carlisle. They dated back to around about 300, 400 AD. So that area, like the areas that kind of would be part of what's called the Crab Orchard, kind of Hopewell. But you find a lot of these settlements that have similar traits. There's evidence of items like that were found like mica that was from the Appalachians. You would find other items like shells and stuff like that from the Gulf Coast. So there's some indication that there was a series of basically kind of trade networks that were established by these cultures. Kind of a famous one, which will be shown in a video later, that attributed to the late Woodland period, but it dates back to the middle Woodland period. In Chillicothe, Ohio, there's a mound that on the ground, as you look at it, it just looks like a mound, right? You can tell, like, if you're going to Cahokia, you see the kind of elevation. From up top, from an aerial view, it's a serpent, so they call it the serpent mound. And what it was used for is somewhat questionable and debatable. But this is like kind of a micro jewelry that they found in this one place in Ohio there. This is what we may believe that they look like. But again, we don't know because it didn't leave behind written records. Now, the Hopewell are going to transcend into what they refer to as the late Woodland period, or what we refer to as the Mississippian. The Mississippians are the ones that are known as the mound builders. Like for a long period of time, St. Louis was referred to as Mound City. This is the culture that is going to build Cahokia, right? And so we take this for granted, but we are close to a major archaeological site, right? And so there's Mississippi settlements that stretch all the way north into Wisconsin. Mr. Chesky was just telling me about a place he was outside Madison called Aslan, that is almost like a little Cahokia. All the way down to like the Gulf Coast, like Alabama, there's a place called Mound City that's almost a replica of Cahokia. All right. So the Mississippians are going to establish kind of the largest kind of kind of concentration of native populations north of Mexico prior to the arrival of Europeans. I'm gonna play this video that kind of is from a series they used to have on VHS called 500 Nations. It's about native cultures in the Americas here. This one specifically is over Cahokia.
Along the Mississippi River, 6 miles from present-day St. Louis, Missouri, there stood a city that once dominated the heart of the continent. At its center was a powerful leader.
A great number of years ago, there appeared among us a man who came down from the sun. This man told us that he had seen from on high that we did not govern ourselves well, that we had no master, that each of us had presumption enough to think himself capable of governing others, while he could not even conduct himself.
1,000 years ago, the great sun, a leader who was both king and pope, lived atop a man-made royal mountain, 10 stories high. Its 16-acre base larger than any pyramid in Egypt.
He told us that in order to live in peace among ourselves, we must observe the following points. We must never kill anyone but in defense of our own lives. We must never know any woman besides our own. We must never take any things that belong to another. We must never lie, nor get drunk. We must not be avaricious. We must give generously and with joy, and share our subsistence with those who are in need of it.
From the heights of his royal estate, the great sun mediated between the Creator and the people, between the sun and the earth. This is Cahokia, city of the sun. The great sun ruled the thriving center of a vast Mississippian culture. Outside the walled city, communities of farmers, hunters, and fishermen stretched for miles, surrounded by fields of corn. With 20,000 residents, no city in the United States would surpass Cahokia's historic size before 1800. Only then would Philadelphia's population eclipse the ancient center.
These people lived in daub and wattle houses on top of the principal people did, the priests and the royalty. They lived in very substantial houses, not teepees. Not teepees. Teepees, Western Plains people. Down here, they lived in houses. They were sedentary. They were farmers. They used the rivers and the bars and the streams as not only for commerce, but for sustenance as well.
With the Mississippi and other major rivers as its highways, Cahokia was linked by trade to a third of the continent. Copper arrived from the Great Lakes, obsidian from Yellowstone, mica and crystal from the Appalachians, gold and silver from Canada, shell from the Gulf of Mexico.
Look at some old live oak trees that have seen so much pass by them. Magnificently dressed Indian people coming down that bar in a dugout, greeting people, standing right here on this bank, having a good time, because they did. You know, Indian people have always known how to have a good time. And there would be a feast prepared. The women would put the corn together, and they'd make sofki. They would roast a deer. The people would bring gifts. You never go to an Indian's house without bringing something that was old as the sunrise.
Cahokia was the pinnacle of a mound-building culture with traditions dating back to before 1000 BC. Thousands of mounds still dot the landscape from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. An average funeral mound in the Ohio Valley was 3 stories tall. Construction could represent 200,000 man-hours of labor, or 100 men carrying the baskets of earth for a year. But few mounds compare with the religious effigy located 50 miles east of Cincinnati, Ohio, the Great Serpent Mound. The enormous snake stretches over 400 yards in length. While their earthworks are the mound builders' most visible legacy, their smaller creations are their most beautiful. Only glimpses remain of the people who changed the course of life on the northern continent. Most of their material world, wooden buildings, boats, baskets, woven textiles, leather footwear, and clothes, have long since turned to dust.
A lot of those images there were from the Interpretive Center there at Cahokia. So like with the Hopewell here, historians, archaeologists like to kind of divide them into kind of certain kind of areas there. Like I said, Cahokia is kind of right up where the middle part there. Like the other big one, they mentioned Mound Mill down in Alabama. And again, like the Hopewell, the use of the rivers was a big part. Justin was telling me about that place at Otzon right there, kind of in Wisconsin. So it's pretty extensive, the kind of the stretch and the reach there. If you ever go to the Interpretive Center, this is kind of essentially kind of like a famous painting on what kind of theory is that kind of life was like, trade, commerce, and stuff like that. But like I said, the largest Mississippian site is just straight up the street. That's in Cahokia. I have 10,000, really it's closer to 20,000. Like I said, this is the largest concentration of people prior to the arrival of Europeans north of Mexico, which we'll talk about Mesoamerica. So this was at one point the largest city, basically, in North America. Like with the Anasazi, you have like numbers in the hundreds or so like here. Cahokia, much larger, much larger. And so all these kind of like, there's a connection like the Hopewell, there's, items that are found in other places that you wouldn't normally find around here. This is kind of an artist rendering of what it may have looked like at its peak around 1000 or so. And if you go there, we take it for granted, but like they have a kind of a replica of the Palisades, the wall that surrounds it. There's evidence like this. There was kind of a game they refer to as chunky stones. So it's kind of a long bowling game they found. So there's evidence of like kind of people engaging in kind of extracurricular activities. The closer you were to the center of Cahokia, probably the higher your social status. I had a professor, I was watching the Smithsonian Channel one time, and one of my former geography professors from SIU was on there. he was excavating a site in O'Fallon that they had found basically kind of like what they believe was kind of like a kind of a suburb of Cahokia. The items that they found were very small, like game, like bones of animals. So they probably were compared to like Cahokia, you found deer and larger game. They were probably of a kind of a lower status. Then over here is that replica they have up. You ever see those poles that's up there heading into State Park? That's like Stonehenge, Woodhenge, what they believe maybe is a sundial. The main kind of like kind of a mound there was, we know, the largest one is Monk's Mound. Now the name was given after the French arrived. There actually was a small monastery on top of there at one point. The theory is where the chief or whoever the leader was had lived and their family. It was a place maybe for religious significance, but again, we don't know because there wasn't any written records there. There was a theory that I was watching. The guy who used to be a professor of mine was talking about how you got those two tiers as you climb up there. That first tier, as you're kind of approaching that, maybe around 1200 or so, that the kind of the leader or the chief can move their dwellings down to that area to be closer to the people, if you will. That's again kind of a theory. All right. But like in the video, they kind of talked about this, kind of showed that it was larger at base than the pyramids, so it's basically kind of a massive structure. This is what it looks like today. Again, we kind of take it for granted. 1 year, I had a kid show me that him and his friends rolled down the side of Monk's Mound in Rubbermaid trash cans, which explained a lot to me. Like I was like, now I know what's going on here. But people used to talk about how they used to sled down there. Before now, it's a kind of a United Nations World Heritage Society. I think just recently they're trying to get it to be a National Historic Society, which can't believe it hasn't been. But like right now, probably University of Illinois sends a lot of archaeology students there to do excavations and digs and stuff like that. We kind of take it for granted. I had this book called 70 Wonders of the Ancient World. Has everything from the Colosseum to the Pyramid, Great Wall. Right in the middle of that is Monk's Mound. All right. Although they say location is Cahokia, Illinois, they're a little wrong on that. I can see where there's a little bit of kind of confusion associated with this. But like I said, this was the kind of largest collection of people north of Mexico prior to the arrival of the Europeans. Now, what happened in Cahokia again is that theories overpopulation, disease, warfare, deforestation. These are all like kind of theories, but a number of cultures like the Cherokee and the Choctaw consider this their kind of their origin point, their origin story. So, like during the solstices, there's a unique shadow that's cast over Monk's Mound and was kind of placed as a location for that. During the solstices, you'll find a lot of people that will go there, but there's a number of Cherokee and Choctaw that kind of find it very significant. Now, which referred to Cahokia, there's Amos Hills. This is an illustration. At one point, a guy named Amos Hill basically lived on there prior to it becoming taken over by the state. Now, the reason it's called Cahokia is that when the French arrived, there was a native culture that was there that was attributed to this, but they didn't arrive until after the Mississippi, right? The Cahokia was actually part of a larger confederation of kind of native cultures where Illinois gets its name. That's the Illini. The Illini, which the name in Algonquin means the men, were essentially a collection of 5 major tribes. The Cahokia, which kind of inhabited this area, the Kaskaskia, Peoria, Michigamme, and Temora. All right. The Peoria, Michigamme are a little bit further north, Temora a little bit further south. This was essentially when the French arrived, they were in this area. Marquette and Joliet were the first ones to kind of come in contact with them. They eventually kind of tied themselves to the French. They kind of established relationships with the French. Unfortunately, that when the French lose the French and Indian War to the British, the Illini basically their kind of like fate was kind of sealed. And then when Illinois became a state in 1818, a year later, 1819, there was something called the Treaty of Edwardsville. That essentially that was the last time the Illini were basically kind of functioned as kind of a unified kind of people. They lost their territory as a result. Now the only Illini tribe I think that's left are the Peoria, the small group that's in Oklahoma. Most of these native cultures, like the Shawnee and Kickapoo and all that stuff, were kind of forced westward into what they call Indian territory. That was right around the time it was called Trail of Tears thing. So the name Illinois comes from that. The French version of what we refer to the Illini. Probably the most famous thing around here that's associated with the Illini is this. You guys know what that is? Have you ever seen that? It's up by Alton. It's a pious suburb that's believed to kind of associated with a kind of a legend. The popular legend written by a guy named John Russell was totally made up. All right, we're not totally sure what the Piattop Road was. Marquette had mentioned seeing this. The one that's if you guys drive along the River Road heading into Alton, that's a kind of a replica of that. And then another kind of confederation of native tribes just to the east, while the Illini are occupying this area, are the Iroquois. Now, like the Anasazi, the Iroquois, the name was actually given to them by their adversaries, mainly the Huron, who are Algonquin-speaking people. In Algonquin, Iroquois means people of the black adder, or a snake, black snake. The Iroquois referred to themselves initially as the Haudenosaunee, which means people of the Longhouse. And the Longhouse was a structure that was very common in basically kind of these kind of tribal settings. It means basically it was a single room structure that's basically kind of stretched for long. There isn't necessarily partitions of like kind of walls and stuff like that. But it served mainly as kind of a dwelling place for multi-generations, but also a place for meetings and the kind of council of elders, if you will. The Iroquois are the ones that invented the game of lacrosse. And for a long time, they actually had their own passports that they could travel on. However, after September 11, 2001, that changed. There was an incident in 2002 when the Iroquois were going to defend their title of the World Lacrosse Championships in London, but they weren't allowed to travel because the passport wasn't officially recognized, right, because they're not officially an independent nation. So the Iroquois now have to kind of travel along. The majority of Iroquois today live in Canada, although you still find some in New York State and parts of the Northeast. So this is kind of an illustration of a longhouse. Inside the longhouse, it served multifunction, place for storage for food, place for dwelling, place for meetings and stuff like that. When we're talking about meetings here, the Iroquois are specifically kind of like more of an organized confederation rather than the Illini are, with the establishment in the 1600s of something called the Iroquois League. Right, and so essentially the Iroquois League is basically made up of 5, now today 6, they were kind of added, but the initial 5 are the Mohawk, where the kind of hairstyle comes from, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. At one point, the Seneca tribe actually migrated into Illinois territory. They were kind of at one point kind of a westernmost there. The Iroquois sided with the British. So during the French and Indian War, they benefited from their British alliance. However, American Revolution, they sided with the British as well. All right, and after the American Revolution, a lot of the Iroquois lost their kind of ancestral kind of claims and territory. That's why the majority of Iroquois tended to move into Canada, into that part. But this is the area that we're talking about, mainly New York State, along Lake Ontario. Like I said, Seneca actually one time migrated into Illinois. The Iroquois League itself was a model that Ben Franklin cited when they were talking about constructing a kind of a government towards the tail end of the American Revolution. Right now, the guy that's credited with establishing the Iroquois League is this historical figure that's also kind of stories based on myth and legend named Hiawatha, who was the chieftain on the Onondaga Nation, who was instrumental in basically getting the others to basically kind of like pool their resources together, mainly against the kind of like Algonquin-speaking people like the Huron as a kind of a defensive measure. Him, along with somebody referred to simply as the Great Peacemaker, were able to kind of broker this kind of alliance, if you will, right? And so like the Iroquois are still around today, and they still kind of hold on to that kind of concept of kind of confederation. The Iroquois have their own, basically their own flag. This is the flag of Hiawatha, right? Which is supposed to represent the Onondaga tribe is the one in the middle, the tree, which is supposed to represent Hiawatha's tree. And then Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, and the other ones are basically the other 4 squares. Right. Okay, we are done. All right, I'm talking about Mesoamerica tomorrow. I was going to read a story about the whole Piattop bird thing, but it would have been required you to pay attention, and that's not really worth it. Yeah, nah. It's a lot of yelling and